Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dimitra Theophanis. I'm president of the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass and host of our monthly Fired Up education series on glass art. We host this Zoom on the first Friday of each month. And we also have Zooms throughout the rest of the month that are for members only. So if you enjoy the program today and would like to see more, I encourage you to visit www.aacgglass.org and become a member so that you can not only attend the live Zooms, but if you can't make it in person, we have a huge video library with hundreds of videos on glass art for members that you can access online. All right, now I'm excited for our program today, but before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor, Habitat Gallery. Habitat Gallery in Michigan is sponsoring today's program with artist Layo Bright and the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art in Connecticut. Since Habitat's establishment in 1971, they have spent over 50 years helping discerning collectors, both established and new, discover the perfect pieces for their collection. Their experience and education is invaluable in helping the collector wade through an often confusing art market. Like many of us, Erin Shea and Corey Hampson, the owners of Habitat, share a passion for glass, and it shines through in the wide range of contemporary glass they represent from all over the world. They also specialize in glass art auctions, and while large auction houses may offer a broad range of materials, Habitat has over 30 years of education, experience, and history in this medium to take the guesswork out of the auction process. Feel free to reach out to Corey and Erin to explore your options at any time. Please also visit their website at www.habitat.com to view the finest in glass art, or visit them in person at their 16,000 square foot gallery complex located just 30 minutes outside of Detroit in Oakland County. Habitat is proud to be a sponsor of this important program and also wants to extend a heartfelt thank you to AACG for years of support and friendship. All right, thanks so much for listening to that, everyone. And thank you again, Habitat, for being our sponsor. Today, we have Layo Bright, a sculptor who is going to talk to us about her artwork, as well as her first solo museum exhibition, Dawn and Dusk, at the Aldrich Contemporary Museum of Art. It includes works in glass and pottery, and the show brings together several ongoing series tracking Bright's synchronized jumps from figuration to abstraction. Working in the round, on the wall, and in relief, Bright's practice centers narratives of ancestry, feminism, mass migration, and the African diaspora. We're going to start off with a talk about her work, and then later in the program, we'll see a video of her in conversation with curator Amy Smith-Stuart from the Aldrich that will go much more in depth into her exhibition. All right, thanks so much, Layo.
Thank you, Dimitra. I'd like to thank the AACG and you all for having me today. It's a pleasure to speak with you about my practice as well as my solo exhibition at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. I am going to share my screen. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, perfect. For those who don't know me, my name is Layo Bright. I am a sculptor born in Lagos, Nigeria. I grew up in Nigeria and started making there, but my practice was more self-taught at the time. And I moved to the United States in 2016 after getting a law degree to attend Parsons School of Design for a master's in fine art. I want to start today talking about some of the inspirations behind my work. I always share this image during artist lectures because it's one that's really informative to my practice. And in this image is a 4-generation picture of women in my family. On the left is my mother. In the middle is my great-grandmother holding my sister, who's the eldest of us children. And to the right is my grandmother. And you can see that they are wearing traditional Yoruba headdress and clothing, which for me makes me think of adornment and self-representation and culture. This is an image that my mother has passed down to us in the family, and it's very dear to me, and one of the images that I used as an inspiration to my body of work. Alongside that, I think about culture, tradition, and design techniques, specifically design techniques in West Africa. As I said, I'm Nigerian, but my tribe is Yoruba, and we're from the southwestern part of Nigeria. And when I think of the culture and the arts, especially, I think of the Ife heads, which were discovered in 1897 in Wumonije compound. But the interesting thing about them is they have a lot of scarification on them. And when I was growing up, my dad would tell me that in different tribes you had different scars to mark which tribe you were from, so you could tell who was like a friend or foe, and it was kind of like a passport, he would say. So you could tell who was like a neighboring tribe or who was within the tribe. And I started to see scarification and markings as a way of marking the body and thinking of identity in a physical way. So these sculptures had specific markings on them, and I incorporate that into my sculptures. And this is just more on that history and the spelling, if you're interested in looking that up more. Another material that I use a lot in my works is the Ghana Must Go bag. And this pattern is some pattern you may have seen, or bag you may have come across yourself. But in Nigeria, it's linked to histories of mass migration, forced mass migration, I should say, where in the 1980s, Ghanaians from Ghana, a neighboring country, were forcefully evicted for not having for overstaying and not having the right papers. There was an oil boom in Nigeria at the time, and in response to the influx of people trying to come in and work and profit from that, the government cracked down and there was a military forced eviction, which was really violent. And a lot of the migrants that were fleeing would put their belongings in these bags and use it to leave the country and walk through the border. So the bags became known as Ghana Must Go bags. And since then, I've come across this bag in different cities around the world. I use them in my abstract paintings to address migration. This is an early work of mine and related to the inspiration you saw earlier of the women in the headdress. And this is a self-portrait. So it started to bring together, this was 2019, I would say. I started to bring together a lot of these markers, signifiers, materials in my work. And you can also see the bag features in this through the leaves in the work. Here are other examples. So I started getting really into making these just as a way to explore the idea further. I didn't know what would come from it, but as an artist, I'm constantly thinking, how is the material driving the theme and my approach to making? So I kept making these. The one on the left was made at the Mass Mocha residency I was in, and the one on the right was showcased in one of my first group exhibitions in New York City. This is an early glasswork from 2021, Visions 1, and it is fused cast draped glass. I was really interested after learning how to work with glass in 2020 during COVID, in expanding that and starting to experiment more with the different techniques I was interested in, especially kiln forming. So a lot of what you'll see with my glass work is kiln formed glass. And this is it on view in Sean Kelly Gallery in New York City, where I showed it in 2021. Here is an example of my abstract work that I spoke about with the bags. So I'm basically using the material itself in the work. And I think that's important to bring in the former life of the material and its previous use, while juxtaposing that with glass, which has this wonderful ability to both be opaque and transparent and play with the materiality and visibility of the bag beneath. So these are my first glass masks that I made in 2020. I will just briefly say my first glass class ever was at Urban Glass. I can talk about that more later, but that was the first time I took a glass course, and it was for casting. But because of the COVID lockdown, the class ended a bit early, and I got a kiln and started practicing and experimenting on my own and started draping and slumping and fusing. The one on the right is the first piece I ever made, like finished actually, and completed. And they ended up being showcased together. I made a series of them named after my mother in Parts and Labor Beacon at a chance encounter. And that was my first showing of the glassworks. This is a showing of them in Berlin, my panel paintings addressing migration. And apparently in Germany, the bags are called Tütenkoffer, which means Turkish suitcase. So also it starts to have this way of speaking to global migration in general. This is from my solo exhibition at Monique Meloche Gallery in 2022 and features very large scale fused glass works, most of which were made out of bullseye Mamaroneck. And I also have a working glass fountain, which features in the Aldrich show, and I'll show those images later. But this was the first showing of the glass fountain made out of urban glass with a team that I worked with. And this is another image of that. The exhibition centered women in my family. This was a sculpture I made of my grandmother in her younger years. And the title of the exhibition was based on a book she wrote about her life, younger life, when she just got married and met my grandfather. And a lot of this centers love and family and community. This piece is a sculpture of my great-grandmother, and this piece will also be in an exhibition at the Pittsburgh Glass Center later this year. I mean, well, in October. So that's coming up, but it's a larger scale piece. I would say most recently, urban glass, and I think of facilities, I think of opportunities that have made my practice possible. And one that comes to mind is the visiting artist fellowship at Urban Glass that I just completed. There I was able to work on blow molds, which I initially started working on the sculpture in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests. And for me, glass has this wonderful way to play with light. And for me, that's very poetic, thinking of hope and despair and which way forward. I think it was a perfect medium for me to think through all these feelings and make a sculpture and body of work at the time. So these blow molds originate from an original sculpture, and I used the lost wax casting technique and made individual blow molds, and the team then proceeded to blow the glass bubble into that. So this is a process image for you to see of how that happened. This is the wax on the left and the blow mold on the right when it was completed, and the wax gets melted out and then a glass bubble gets blown in. And it's an addition work, comes in different colors. And for me, that's a way to play with not just the possibilities of working with glass, but also color and light and dimension. That work was featured in my first group show with Halsey McKay Gallery, as pictured here. That's a full view on the exhibition, and this is Dawn Golden Brown on view. This is a pretty recent work from the Bloom series, and I'll go into that more with the Aldrich show. But this just explores some of the bodies of work in that. This one is Bloom in Mint and Salmon Pink. That is on view in my solo show, currently on view at Halsey McKay Gallery. So I'll just jump right into Dawn and Dusk. And I'm very excited to be having my first solo museum show, curated by Amy Smith-Stuart. Amy Smith-Stuart is the chief curator of the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. Smith-Stuart joined the Aldrich as curator in 2013, and since then, she has organized 42 exhibitions and projects at the museum. Her unique perspective has brought artists to the Aldrich during important stages of their careers, including first solo museum presentations with artists Milano Chow, Lucia Hierro, Eva Lewitt, Jesse Reeves, and so on. In addition to her work with the Aldrich, Smith-Stuart has organized more than 70 exhibitions in museums, collections, galleries, and temporary spaces. She is a founder of the eponymous nomadic curatorial project, Smith-Stuart, previously located on the Lower East Side. She began her career as a curator at MoMA PS1, where she mounted 19 exhibitions and projects. From 2006 to 2007, she was a curatorial advisor for Mary Boone Gallery and has organized exhibitions at Socrates Sculpture Park, the Noguchi Museum, and the Peter Norton Collection. She has served on the faculty at the School of the Visual Arts, MFA Fine Arts Department, and the Sotheby's Institute of Art. Her writing has appeared in books and catalogs published by Taschen, Gregory R. Miller and Co., Revolver Publishing, Bates College Museum of Art, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, MoMA PS1, KW Institute of Contemporary Art, and Chata, among others. I would also like to thank the generous supporters of Dawn and Dusk, Ellen and Andrew Chelly. Significant support has been provided by the Center for Craft. Additional support has been provided by the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass and Bill and Christy Gautreaux. The catalog is supported by Eric Diefenbach and James Keith Brown Publication Fund. Production support is provided by Diana Bowes and Jim Torrey Commissions Fund. So when Amy and I discussed the show, Dawn and Dusk kept coming back to me, which is the body of work you saw earlier done at Urban Glass. And thinking through that, I wanted that to be the first thing that people encountered walking into the exhibition. So the exhibition does have two main points at which you can enter. The first one is up the stairs. As soon as you come in, you go up the stairs to the galleries, and this is what you confront there. Dawn and Dusk are placed on custom-made pedestals, which I rub in Nigerian camwood. It's a pigment that I get from Nigeria, from a tree. And a lot of my inspiration does come from nature in this exhibition and in general. So I wanted to bring some of that into the pedestals, into where the work sits. I think that's also important, thinking of not just the work itself, but how it's placed and on what it's placed. I think that reads into the story. So Dawn is the first work you encounter, and Dawn and Dusk are the same figure, but they're different editions of work because Dawn is playing with transitions of light from clear to color, while Dusk is playing with transitions of light from black to color. And I did that in kind of thinking through dawn as more like the dawn of day and thinking through ideas of hope and a new start, while dusk is like the end of day and like this sense of apprehension, where at the time I was making these pieces inspired by the protests following Breonna Taylor's killing, I was having all these conflicting emotions and wanted to convey that through glass. And this is a picture of dawn, thinking of like just showing that transition more. It employs a lot of the signifiers and markers I talked about earlier, like the scarification and the headdress, which is a scarf in this sculpture, and also nature with the color of the sculpture being leaves and reminiscent of the bark of a tree while being placed on a pedestal that gets its pigment from a tree. I really wanted to have that in the work very predominantly. And here is Dusk as well. That is located in its own room, so it's enclosed, and the floor has been painted an indigo to match the color of the sculpture. When people walk into this space, they do say dawn has a very different feel from dusk. which is important because that was the point of having the additions be in the same line of sight, but have two different ways that you experience them. And that's just like an install view to get you to get more of a sense of what that's like. So with the flooring, it kind of casts like a light in the space as well, which reads into the work. And you can see that in this picture, Bloom in Spring and Purple, the wall installation is also in view, which is a transition into the next room. So Bloom in Spring Green and Purple is one of the early Bloom works I made. This next room of the galleries pictures or portrays different women. Amy thinks of it as and describes it as like a sisterhood. So it's not just family members, it's friends, it's colleagues, it's people I'm in general inspired by and whose stories I want to portray. But this one is of my mother. And when I think of a lot of bodies of work I've made, she's part of that because she's a big muse in my work. Kind of thinking through my beginnings and how she's helped me navigate a lot of life issues, but also thinking of the matriarch as a symbol in my body of work. So this comes with an installation of um, glass flowers that are in different colors and kind of like bloom around the room. The idea is thinking of cross-pollination, thinking of the language of flowers to speak to migration, cycles of life and family, and the self as well. So it kind of acts as a metaphor and blooms in the space. And this is the work like in more detail on its own. And this piece is also on the cover of Glass Quarterly for Urban Glass for the fall issue. So if you happen to have received that, this is the image. And this is an install view of Bloom and Spring Green, as well as one of my trellis sculptures specifically made for the Aldrich exhibition. I will say a lot of the works were new works specifically made for this exhibition. And the trellis sculptures address this idea of African art and the mask, which has been looted or taken in the past, and this idea of repatriation, but also cross-pollination of culture, which the flowers and the blooms represent as they kind of like crawl out of the trellis. So there is a Benin mask embedded in each frame of the trellis. And you can perhaps see it on the left. It's a black mask and it's kind of within the frame. So it also invites the viewer to look deeper. I do think of slow art in my work and how do you invite people to take a closer look, even though there's so much detail. This is an install view, and one of the larger Bloom portraits is in this work. This is Bloom in green, blue, and brown, with the two trellis sculptures on the either side of the work. And in this room, I painted two of the large walls with a camwood pigment, again from the tree, that I'm using as a wall skin. I call them my wall skins. That is also on view at the Armory Show. If you happen to be in New York City, I have a site-specific installation with the same painting. So this is site-specific. I painted it by hand myself at the Aldrich. And I'm just thinking through this like lineage of healers in my family because the pigment does have medicinal properties. So when I make the mix, I'm thinking of that and imbuing the space with some of that healing aura. And that's a look at the work installed on the wall. This is a zoomed in picture of that. And this has like cast, fused, and blown glass involved in this. Some of the blown glass flowers were made at the Museum of Glass during my residency there last year. And this is a second trellis sculpture, an installation view of works in this room on the space. And this is Bloom in orange, red, and blue. This is a portrait of Rikia, a friend of mine. She actually has tribal marks on her face. She had them done when she was a baby. So I wanted to bring her actual tribal markings in and show that it's not just something you see on these sculptures, it's a mark of representation and tribe. So in this piece, it's actually on her face. This is an install view of the two large bloom works, and on the right is a sculpture that has one of the Gailey pieces. I just want to like kind of zoom to that so you can see it. Referencing the earlier picture I showed, I still make those initial sculptures, but now they have glass flowers embedded in the leaves as well. This is an early portrait, a very early portrait, and we included that in the show to show people some of the beginnings and how I started working in mixed media. Um, this is an install view of the room that has the glass fountain in it. So this work has been featured in Monique Milosh Gallery. And this is the first time I'm showing it in an institutional setting. This fountain is inspired by my grandmother's home. So we wanted that to be in the sound gallery separate from the other works in the Bloom gallery and the Bloom space. So it kind of sits in the middle of the abstract panel works. And you can see like when you walk around the room, you get this sound from the fountain and the water spilling and going to the different layers of the fountain. Um, and then the marked series, Speaking to Migration, kind of like surround the fountain work. This is just a zoomed in view of what it looks like when it's working. So the water like spills out at the top and kind of, we wanted to shape that in the shape of leaves so that it kind of trails the water downwards. And the floor has like crushed glass on it. And some of these leaves that kind of curve and stand out were made at Tyler School of Art during my residency there. And this is like a unique work. This is very early from 2020. It's called Point of Last Scatter. And this is actually the only piece that is a blend of the migration works and my figurative works. And this is marked Nexus. I'm really interested in lines, which in my figurative work come in the form of scarification, but in my panel works come in the form of these lines that kind of trail movement and think of direction alongside migration. This is the largest work in that room. It's Horizon Line 1 and 2, and that's 40 by 80, and it's all fused glass overlaid on the bag pattern. And I'll end with this one. This is a new work exploring ideas of hope. Again, I think like, especially with a lot of the glassworks I'm making, I'm thinking of emotions and conveying some of the either hope or despair around the themes in my work. And this one is titled Ray Glimmer of Hope. And it does form like a sun ray, kind of thinking of like greener pastures and what it means to like um, survive the travails of migration and all that that contains. And I will end by saying that this is the catalog for the exhibition at the Aldrich that just became available. So if anybody would like to read Amy and I's interview and see images, install images, and more in-depth essays, please feel free to get that through the Aldrich. And before I start the video, Demetra, do you have any questions or want to
I
check?
do. One question is, what guides your choice of materials when you're creating your sculpture?
Um, I guess I'm thinking about the relationship I have with the material. I'm really thinking of what life it has had, especially with like the bags and other materials and the headdress. I literally use those materials in my work. But with the glass, I think it's just a wonderful metaphor to discuss a lot of the issues I'm concerned with, like migration, identity. Glass has this wonderful ability to be both opalescent and transparent. And I think it can either obscure or reveal like the layers to um, the layers to discussing all these topics and points of entry that I think are really important to helping a viewer to understand a work. When you're not there as an artist, like you have material that can give people an emotional connection, like glass can be reflective, like people always say, oh, it's interesting that I can see my portrait within your portraits. I think that's a beautiful way to see it, because truly this extends beyond the subjects in my work. I'm trying to get people to have an introspective moment, and I think that's why I'm drawn to the materials I use.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Would you like me to proceed with the video? Do you have any?
Please go ahead.
Okay. 1 second. What's that? Okay. Bear with me. Hard to get started with this. Okay.
Layo, it's so wonderful to be with you tonight. I'm so excited to talk about your incredible exhibition at the Aldrich, Dawn and Dusk. So the exhibition spans work in both glass and pottery made over the last 4 years from 2000 to 2020 to 2024. And there's so many inspirations that are cited within the work, from the ancient city of Ife, your matrilineal heritage, West African textiles, as well as I know you're inspired by several contemporary artists, including Fred Wilson and Alison Sarr. So I thought maybe to start, you could talk a little bit about both the political and the biographical resonances in the materials that your works carry.
Thank you, Amy. It's wonderful speaking with you, and thank you so much for curating my debut museum solo show. It's been truly an honor working with you, and I'm so excited to speak with you tonight. To your question about the political and biographical references in my work, I do think materials play a central role in my practice. I'm constantly thinking about the histories imbued in materials, what they've carried, what they signify, who they signify, and what they talk about. And a lot of the works in this show speak to that, in the sense that, for example, with my abstract panel works, they have the Ghana Must Go bag embedded in them. And this is a plastic polyethylene bag that has this plaid checkered pattern on it that many people may have seen before, but it actually is linked to migration and migration stories around the world. It has that global significance. And I remember during our first studio visit, we talked a lot about that, like how you see this material and you get these markers from it and you remember where you've seen it and what it connotes. That is very important, that people can recognize that maybe they've come across this material, but they may not know the histories that have to do with marginalizing bodies or the class significance of it, or how it has to do with border imperialism, or like closed borders and bodies being marked, not for entry or for entry. I think of all the layers and complexities that the materials hold in that sense. Also, I'm really drawn to the previous life of materials. So with my busts, I use the gele head wrap, and the gele is a very important fashion item in West Africa. It's basically this very stiff fabric worn by women as a head wrap. And we make it into these elaborate, interesting styles, but I like to focus on the halo style of them. I do think that it's a material that points to agency for me, that points to women's voices and women acting as a way of resisting the status quo. Because at the time that they were imposed in Lagos, Nigeria, where I'm from, it was a colonial imposition, and one that wasn't necessarily cultural at the time. But then it became so, with women then taking that on and making it their own and using it as an act of resistance and beauty and adornment. And this is just some of the examples that I think of in the show, like the political, the biographical, the geographical as well, like thinking of all the layers that we're covering through some of these materials and the stories. Most importantly is the stories that are embedded in them.
Yeah, I mean, the storytelling in your work is so rich. And I know that when we walked through the galleries, when you were first conceiving of the exhibition, we really thought about the visitor's experience and the movement and the experience of all these different bodies of work. And the exhibition spans 3 rooms, and each gallery has a very different mood, a very different temperament. And I thought, since many of the visitors might not have had a chance to see the exhibition, you could talk a little bit about the choice of the installation, the grouping of the works, also for the first time, how you used camwood on the walls, and just the overall experience that you were trying to convey for the audiences.
Yeah, I love that question because we really talked through this together, and I have to like truly commend you, Amy, for having an amazing curatorial approach. I think like when we had the studio visits and I was just looking at all the work, the way you just calmly like talked through it and we got to understand the vision was so profound for me. As you said, we spaced the works out into different rooms. And we were really thinking, how do people enter the space? And I don't think we went through that many titles. I think Dawn and Dusk was our one and only title.
True.
Because we did have that clarity and synergy as well to how we were thinking. But basically the first room you walk into when you get up the stairs is the title of the exhibition. We wanted to confront people with that, like Dawn and Dusk in their line of sight. So Dawn is first, and Dawn catches the light because there's a window there, which is so lovely to show that luminescence to the glass, and also point to the pedestals that are custom rubbed in camwood, which I'll talk more about in a second. And then in the little gallery behind that, the camera obscura in the obscura, yeah, I was trying to remember the name, is Dusk. And Dusk is this moody blue, and the floor is painted like an indigo to kind of play off of that and contrast to the camwood pedestal. But most importantly, that room is very contemplative because we move from dawn to dusk. And the body of work is inspired by Breonna Taylor's killing in 2020 and the protests that resulted from that. I was in a residency at the time and just thinking through agency, protest, what it means to kind of navigate the difficulty of social injustice and what it means to resist such. Like, how do we like get back up and have hope, and also a place for anger, and like, how do we process all these feelings? And I had just started working with glass as well. And I felt like glass is this wonderful intermediary that can convey so many emotions. And I thought how you and I spoke about it and how you curated it was so special because we get like the light from dawn, which is like the hope and like this idea of, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel and just the hope in humanity. And then we go into dusk, which is more moody and a space to contemplate like this sense of trauma and despair, but also like strength that, you know, is inherent in that, like we can overcome this. And then we move from that into the wonderful main gallery space, which is in many ways connected to the previous room with the custom rubbed pedestals of camwood, but is also its own space of highlighting women that have inspired me or have their own stories, women who are present, women who are formidable, who for me have gone through different seasons and cycles of life, but are incredibly just inspiring. So I have a self-portrait in the room, which is a loaned work. And it's special that people get to see the beginnings and what the work looked like before I worked in glass. I love that you were like, we should do that. We should show people like those are your works that are mixed media. And on the wall next to that, or on the other side of the doorway, is a bust with a head wrap and a gele. It's modernized with my style in the sense that it has glass flowers. And there's also my first ever custom site-specific wall painting at the Aldrich, which you really trusted me with that. I remember you walking into the studio and it was a lattice I had up and you were like, maybe we can edit this. Like, I want to see what's behind that. And I had painted the wall. And I just love that edit session where when we removed the lattice, like you and I literally removed it. I felt so bad that you were helping me move my lattice, but we took it off and it just like made so much sense. And I had never done that yet. So I just want to say, aside a wonderful curatorial experience, even the studio visits with you were so informative and so enriching. Really made me see my practice anew. So the wall painting was done at the Aldrich by me, and it does have this calming aura. But the main thing about it is it comes from Osum. That's the name of the tree, which is camwood or sandalwood, as most people know the tree. But in Southwest Nigeria, the Yoruba tribe, which is my tribe, uses the heartwood and sometimes the bark of the tree for its medicinal properties. So it comes out in this like reddish pigment with like the sawdust and everything. It's just red. And I used it as a wall painting, kind of thinking through this method of healing of it's almost like a prayer in some ways, like thinking through healing and what it means to like create a new presence in the space, take over the space, wish for a regenerative energy, which many people told me they felt such a calm aura in the space, and that meant so much, just knowing that it did have the effect. It also has medicinal properties, so it's used for like skin ailments and such. And I kind of felt like it was a salve in some ways to like a lot of the wounds that are not seen and not physical. And it could just like let the whole space be that salve in that moment. So that is the backdrop to the largest bloom portraits I've made to date. And they sit on the wall kind of like in an act of witnessing, but also taking up space and standing in their strength. And there's as well an installation and two trellis sculptures, which kind of reference this transatlantic way of being and navigating being Nigerian, having this culture, but also this cross-pollination that happens at some point. And there are Benin masks embedded in the sculpture, so people have to like look in. And then the last room has a working glass fountain modeled after my grandmother's home, as well as the abstract panels we discussed. And to think of all these together is a way of bringing, the personal and the community aspects of my practice, thinking of women's stories, my stories, people around me and my community as well. And also people I may not know, because I feel like with the global symbolism of the bag, a lot of people connect to that, even though we have different histories.
I know that the newest works, the glass portraits with the blooms, there's different references to home in them. And you selected flowers that are native to Nigeria. Why was this important to you? And then also, could you talk about, I know there's a self-portrait in the show. I know the fountain is dedicated to your grandmother, but there's other women in your life that are in those portraits.
Yeah. In terms of the other women, my sister is one. I remember finishing the work and she's like, "This is the first one you've made of me." I was like, "Uh-oh." Yeah, she's like, "We're really close." And she's like one of my best friends. Thinking of like sisterhood, like literally
Right.
sisterhood in terms of friendship and other relationships built. There's also Rekia Odutola. We went to school for law together, and she's a model now in New York City. And we both have that migration story, which is very close because we both studied law and then went into creative paths afterwards. And there is Shade Ologundudu. She's an art writer and a friend. And I've just always been inspired by her. Every time we talk, I'm really taken by what we connect on, our backgrounds, and just how resilient and amazing she is as a person. There's a lot of this that is just intuitive. Like I meet a friend or want to talk about someone and I just want to make work about them. I feel like it's what I want to see in the world. I want to see them portrayed and them taking up space. Yeah, so those are the other women in the show. And the reference to home, I mean, home is really personal in many ways, just because I grew up in Lagos most of my life. I mean, people ask, oh, did you grow up in the United States? No, I just moved here in 2016. It's home away from home. But there's an aspect of my practice that deals with a sense of displacement. Not forced displacement, but just this longing in some way, knowing that I'm straddled between two worlds in a sense. So I'm referencing home through like, certain flowers, like the yellow trumpet flower is Nigeria's national flower, and that features in the show prominently. But also like a mix of flowers from around the world, and especially here in the United States, just referencing like a cross-pollination and like straddling two worlds, and knowing that both take up an equal amount of space, but in different ways. And I think part of that is me accepting that it's not really fighting against it. It's just like telling the story of how identity has changed so much now. Like, it's not one thing. And that story keeps getting rewritten, each year in everybody's life. I mean, thinking of this year and the elections and just around the world in general, like there's so much changing the landscape of what identity looks like. And for me, that landscape is this blooming garden that takes shape and has different cycles to it, and blooms and withers, and the flowers fold in. And I think there's a beautiful storytelling in the language of nature that I'm using to amplify and highlight my story and different people's stories.
Oh, it's so beautiful, Layo. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
I guess everyone always asks, and I know that when we first met, it was so interesting for me to learn that you taught yourself how to work with glass. And I guess many people ask you this, but what was your attraction to working with glass? And also, when people walk through the exhibition, you're using so many different types of techniques and combining them. So it's very experimental. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about, your first experiences working with glass, why you were attracted to it, and then also all the different techniques that you're employing within the exhibition itself.
That's a very great question, because I get that a lot. Like, people are like, wait, you've only been working with glass for 4 years. Like, it's super fun. I mean, my first attraction to glass, as you asked, it was watching Blown Away on Netflix. And just, I mean, for me, it was a reality TV show because I binge watch a lot of reality TV. And I actually ran into the winner of season 1, Deborah, at an artist talk, and recognized them. And they told me, oh, if you really love this, you should like take a class at Urban Glass. And I did. I actually followed through with that. And I remember my Urban Glass session was kiln casting, which is, I still do that a lot, actually. It's basically processing glass in a kiln where you melt crushed glass in a mold until it takes the shape of the mold. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was unlike anything else I'd ever worked with. To quote my teacher from the class, it was magical. I was like, wait, I get to make something out of this, like for real? And I just couldn't get that out of my head. I think it piqued my curiosity in a sense that, like, what else can I do? So to the second half of your question, I do a lot of different processes. I do mainly kiln forming techniques, like, so anything that's processed in the kiln is kiln forming. I don't do hot glass, which is like glass blowing. And kiln forming for me is the unsung hero in many ways, because people think it's only one thing, but there's so much that is possible, and that's what I'm exploring. So I drape, I slump, I fuse, and I cast glass, which looks different. And I think that's what I really enjoy. Each process looks like a different thing. And a lot of people don't know the material is glass at the end of the day. It kind of transforms it to this resilient, really tough material that people liken to like other ceramics or like resin. And I'm like, no,
Resin,
it's all
yeah.
glass. Yeah, or rubber. Someone was like, that's rubber. I was like, no, it's not. It's actually cast solid glass. And I love the sense of wonder it creates, not just for me, but for other people to see that there is so much that this medium holds. There's so much of it that hasn't even been tapped yet. And I love that. So I will use all those techniques. And I also got a little bit into flame working, which is like
Wow.
melting glass with a torch. And then glass blowing. During my residency at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma last year, the team made some blown glass flowers for me, which I really love that they come out of the frame. So I use like as many techniques as I can think of.
I know that makes sense too, because when you come at it, when you're teaching yourself how to use it, then you're going to try all these different techniques, combining them. And
Exactly.
when I walk people through the exhibition, so many people, some works look really like glass, but there are others that they don't believe me at all.
That's funny. Then it's working.
And honestly, I think it makes people they get very close to the work.
Yeah.
They really want to understand how it was made.
I can
So I
imagine.
guess we're probably getting close to time, and I know that everyone always wants to know this, but there's so many new moves in the work. You made a lot of new work for this exhibition, as you mentioned, some of it really much larger scale, experimenting with different processes and combining them in different ways. But I was wondering if you could reveal where you're headed next, what you have on view now, or what's coming up.
That's great too. I am showing at the Armory this week. So if anybody's in town and going to see the Armory show, I am showing with Halsey McKay Gallery in booth 328. So come by the gallery sector and see us. I'm also going to be having a solo booth at 154 London with Superposition Gallery. That's October 9th to 14th, I believe, at Somerset House. And I'm also partaking in Art X Lagos in November this year. Yeah, as well as the Pittsburgh Glass Center has an amazing show curated by Alyssa Velasquez. And that opens in October as well. And I love that because it shows one of my large initial works that were like a mixed process.
Oh, that's so exciting. You have a lot going on. Wow.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I have to do a little pitch for our new catalog.
Yes.
That is coming out this week. So stay tuned for that. And that will be available at the museum shop and also on our website. Layo, it's been such a pleasure. You're an amazing artist. The exhibition is incredible. It's been a tremendous honor to work with you on it. Really, I'm just so excited to share it with the world.
Thank you so much, Amy. It has truly been amazing working with you. I've told you that so many times, but
I feel exactly the same. Thank you so much for finding the time.
Thank you too.
The show. So
thank
you,
you,
Layo.
Thank you so much, Amy. Have a good one. Talk
You
soon.
too. Bye.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so I won't go much into this then because Amy and I discussed it, but these are some upcomings and ongoings. So I also have this on my website and on my social media, which is my name. So if anybody wants to keep up to date with that or subscribe for the newsletter, please do. I would like to thank AACG so much for not only supporting my exhibition, but also inviting me to speak today. This is so lovely. Thank you so much, Dimitra. I know we shared a lot of emails, but I appreciate how amazing you are and just how helpful and kind. And this has truly been an honor getting to know you and the team, but also speaking with everyone today. And I'd like to thank Habitat as well for sponsoring this talk. So
thank you so much, Layo. It was really such a pleasure to have you on the program. Your work is so insightful, and it just really, I think one interesting thing that that you brought up, I'd like to address in a moment. First, I just want to thank again Habitat for sponsoring this episode. And if you want to stop your screen share, we can start a Q&A if you have a few minutes to stay with us. Great. So one thing that you spoke about, which I thought was really interesting, was the Blown Away program and how that sort of kicked off your interest in glass, because Blown Away has been a pretty controversial topic amongst glass artists online, and people having different opinions in terms of how that portrays glass art. And I think that your experience really speaks to the importance of just gaining visibility for the medium, because you saw something on TV where you were just really transfixed by the material. And you didn't take that to go and just make paperweights. You took it and you incorporated it in a fine art practice, using the material in a very innovative way, and now having your first solo exhibition at a museum. So it really speaks to how just getting glass out there into the community in some way can really enhance the number of artists that are able to access the material and utilize it in a very profound manner. So that was really nice to hear. We do also have some questions in the chat. Some I think that you addressed within your talk. Someone asking when you came to the US, and I believe you said 2016.
Yes, it was 2016, but I graduated in 2018 and started making, really making the body of work in 2019.
Okay. And let's see here. Your studio practice is in New York, is that correct?
Yes, it is. I'm located in Brooklyn, which helps because for the glass blowing, Urban Glass and Brooklyn Glass are where I work with teams out of. And then my studio practice, I have a studio for my kiln and kiln forming. So that's also in Brooklyn.
Great. And with your pieces, someone was asking whether the larger assemblage is glued or whether you are perhaps tack fusing all of that together.
Both. I don't have a big enough kiln to process all of that. So where I cannot do it in a big kiln, I am gluing. Hextol is
Yeah.
mostly great. But yeah, I'm not opposed to using glue. I think for a long time I was like kicking myself, like I don't want to glue anything. Everything has to be fused together.
Right.
But there are limitations to that, I realized. And I was like, for the grander work and for the sake of like exploring the form, I need to forsake these other things that will be detrimental to that. So I would fuse as much as possible for the kilns I can rent, and where I can't, I glue.
Yeah, I think a lot of artists come to that realization where, in the beginning, you have this notion that everything has to be done hot, to really be a glass artist. And then you realize, no, glue is your best friend because, it can really allow you to scale up and sometimes also even to ship more safely. So that's nice as well.
I'm glad I'm not alone. Thanks.
Also, again, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but want to mention again, someone asking about your artistic values, your motivations, and your inspiration, and kind of the interplay in balancing that with your choice of materials. Do you have any new materials or directions you're looking at, or does that kind of come through just an organic process of your day-to-day?
I think both. I'm truly mostly in the studio. I once interned with, when I do just an artist talk, I always talk about being a studio assistant as a lawyer. So I was at this point where I was like, I can either go after law school to work in a firm, and I got a job offer, but I interned with an artist for 6 months, and the artist's name is Kpeju Alatishe. She is such an amazing inspirational artist, and she's a sculptor. And she would tell me, how long do you work on your art? And I'm like, yeah, when I feel the inspiration. And she's like, that's not going to cut it. Like, you need to be in the studio every day. I think she had a rule like 12,000 hours or 20,000 hours or something. I don't know if anybody in the chat knows this, but there's a certain number of hours you need to dedicate to be great at a craft or at a skill or anything. So she's like, that's what you should hold yourself up to. And I thought she was just giving me a hard time, honestly, because I was like, I just need to go with the flow. But it was actually that. And when I started working with like glass and other materials, I need to be in the studio every day. It's not that the work will do what it needs to do. It's more like thinking through the material. I need to have a connection with it. I need to know what it can do. I need to try out 10 different things with it before I do the one thing that resonates with me and works. There's a lot of unseen parts to being a creative or making anything, like just anything. It's like, what is it called? Like research and development, R&D. Like I treat it like that. So I am looking at how much further I can pull the material or treat it, or even now installations, like the wall installations weren't just me going there and tossing things on the wall. That took like 6 months of experimenting, testing things out, knowing what it could do, trying out different pigments and herbs. So I do think of this, the organic part comes when I've done all that testing. I'm like, this is what feels right. But the testing is like a huge part of it, like understanding the material very well. And I am interested in other things, like printmaking has always, I have prints, I used to do prints, and I still come back to that. I think there's something about layering and technique and process that I just generally love. And that is also a very process-oriented layering technique. So yeah, I would go into printmaking maybe. And I'm also open in general to anything else.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you brought up something that is really critical for all artists. And it's always kind of a battle too, because experimentation is so important. It's such a huge part of the process. And yet many of us struggle with finding the time for that, you know, trying to balance actually making a living with having the time to devote to experimentation, which is not only costly in terms of time, but materials, and there's a lot of risk involved. So it's definitely something that, you know, artists do behind the scenes that maybe isn't immediately noticeable in the work, but is such an immense part of the process. So,
I
yeah,
love that you say that. I mean, for me, it's residencies. I mean, when people ask why I'm doing so many residencies, I'm like, that's why. I
yeah,
get
yeah,
the facilities, the time, probably a stipend.
right.
We'll say time is the most expensive thing
Yes.
an artist can dedicate to their practice, but I have forced it to happen through residencies. And even if it's a short one, there's so much you can do with it. And you don't have to think of the cost or, you know, I mean, usually, and things are covered that otherwise would be difficult to do on one's own. And I use that as my think tank. I use that as my experimentation, especially when there's no show or anything required. I'm like, this is what it's about. And I
Mhm.
really lean into that so that by the time I'm back at the studio, I can focus on the direction I've resolved during the residency. So then it makes sense for cost and use of facilities.
Right.
Just to add to your point, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you again for being here, Layo. It's been such a pleasure to hear you talk about your work, and congratulations again on your current exhibition and everything that you have upcoming. It's really exciting to see what you're doing as you are just yet another person paving the way for glass in the fine art world. So we're so appreciative of that and a chance to get to know you and your story.
Thank
This
you.
video will go up on AACG's public YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to share it with their friends, they're welcome to do that. We usually get that up there in the next day or so. So thank you again, Layo. Thank you, Habitat, for sponsoring. And thanks everyone for being with us. We really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lion.